So, dude, not only is this season 6, but you and I both have sabbatical for the entire year at the same time.
How sweet is this? When I had sabbatical toward the beginning of my career, I had goals. I had a schedule. It turns out sabbaticals later in your career are a slightly different thing, at least at my end.
You have been watching TV 12 hours a day. And what I love is you got into this rabbit warren of 1970s cop shows that you and I were raised on.
They're so much fun to relive.
My two big ones that I have seen every episode was Chips.
Oh, yeah.
With John and Ponch.
Apparently, I wasn't a super fan because I didn't have the poster on my bedroom wall like you did.
And my other favorite was Starsky and Hutch.
Well, how could you not like Starsky and Hutch? They had that incredible car.
Oh, it was a Gran Torino. So what were your favorites?
You named some of my favorites from like the 70s. If we move into the 80s, you know, there were things like Magnum P.I. And of course, there was Miami Vice with the exceedingly well-dressed Crockett and Tubbs. Hey, you know what we could do, since we seem to have a lot of time on our hands, and we need an opening for season 6, right? Why don't we do a buddy cop thing? Wouldn't that be cool?
I don't have a great history with cops in person. I don't mind watching them on TV.
Come on, you should use all your experience with law enforcement, which I had no idea how considerable it was. And we need to pivot this into some kind of opening thing. Think about it this way. Out of all of the cop shows that you used to watch, who would you be?
Oh, that one's easy. Jim Rockford.
Ooh, of the Rockford Files. Nice.
Now, the problem is he wasn't actually a cop. He was a private eye, but he was everything I admire. He was bumbling. He was underestimated. He was a little bit shady. And then it's perfect for you because his sidekick was a convicted con man who would do anything to get by on the street.
I have to be the con man?
Yeah.
All right. Well, okay, so most of our listeners have absolutely no idea about any of the cop shows that we just mentioned. Maybe their parents watched. I don't know. So let's do an updated cop show theme, admittedly with a slight 90s vibe to it, for Quantitude. Here we go. Patrick Curran and his actor partner Greg Hancock. Two cops. They're no model citizens. In fact, they're highly skewed. Don't even think about regressing to the mean around them. And if you step out of line even 3 standard deviations, they'll Windsorize your ass.
No.
Oh, come on.
Dude, I am barely here. I didn't want to record this in the first place.
No, hear me out. We could be like CFI Miami.
No.
The Dukes of Hazzard Function.
No.
Magnum CI?
Executive no.
Come on. Brooklyn 99% confidence interval.
Okay, now it's just getting desperate.
Okay, what about this? Hawaii 05.
No.
Okay, wait.
Stop. Listeners, on behalf of Quantitude, I apologize. Welcome to season 6.
Rockford file drawer problem? 21 Jasp Street? No?
Welcome. My name is Patrick Curran, and along with my sabbatically pantsless friend Greg Hancock, we make up Quantitude. We are a podcast dedicated to all things quantitative, ranging from the relevant to the completely irrelevant. In this week's episode, our first of season 6, Greg and I visit with Dr. Ethan McCormick, an assistant professor of educational statistics and data science in the School of Education at the University of Delaware. After catching up on Ethan's international adventures, we discuss his recent work on using growth factors as predictors of distal outcomes, and how pretty much everything he expected to find came out exactly the opposite. Along the way, we also discuss chainsawing family memories, the 31st first day of school, Irish goodbyes, barn doors, ridiculous footnotes, blatant plagiarism, done and dusted, throwing our code at your advisor, landing a triple axel, umlauts, being proudly uneducated, hiding in the bathroom, and in fairness to us. We hope you enjoy this week's episode. So do we play the cop thing out for the whole season, or can I just count that as done and done?
If I don't get to wear a Hawaiian shirt, I'm out.
Anyway, welcome to a sabbatical-fueled Season 6. You and I do somehow have a sabbatical coming up for the entire year.
The entire year, people. I am pants-free, committed to it. For the whole year. I'll show you right now.
No, sit down. Sit down.
All right.
But what is the tradition is how is this day different than any other day?
There you go.
The way Carolina works is every 5 years you can apply for one semester, and then you can apply for a competitive addition to make it 2 semesters. Mm-hmm. And I had done that, and I submitted, and I was very fortunate to get this. And the kids were home from spring break, and I got the news, and I came out, and I said, this is awesome. I said, I just found out I got a 4-year sabbatical. And Christy, bless her heart, with total sincerity, looked up from the kitchen counter and said, I thought you were on sabbatical this year.
Just shows how much you do.
Well, I took some defense to it, and I was like, no, I'm not on sabbatical. She said, Dad, what day is it? And I said, it's Tuesday. She said, what time is it? I said, it's 1 o'clock. And she said, what are you doing right now? And I was poking at a bean soup in a slow cooker, and I just put the lid on and shuffled back to my office.
Excellent. Well, for other people, it is the start of the school year. Was that a thing for you, by the way, growing up? Was the start of the school year like a big deal in your household? Because your parents were teachers.
If you call my mom shoving us out the door an hour before and you could hear the deadbolts thrown behind us, then yeah, it was a big deal for us. One tradition we have now, and I think you do this yourself, we had a first day of school picture. And we have a beautiful, huge oak out in the front yard. And for all the years, the kids would go out and I would just pull out the camera and we would have a quick picture in front of the tree before we got in the car to go to school. But the funny thing was they both went to college for the first year last fall. My wife and I were not having a great time with them leaving the house because there are only 2 kids. And so we were instantly empty nesters. But by the world's worst luck, there was a thunderstorm that snapped off the top of the tree and it was hanging over the house. And I had to bring a crane in to have it cut and pulled out because in North Carolina, trees are massively huge. They took out the tree, I kid you not, on the first day of school. So my wife and I are looking through the glass at the tree where we take this picture when the kids are gone out of the house on their first day of school. And there are a team of guys just chainsawing and grinding it up. Kurt Vonnegut could not have written a better scene.
Just so symbolic.
You know whose first day of school it is as well.
I think I do.
You know everybody who we have with us today on his first day of school at his new job is Dr. Ethan McCormick.
Woohoo!
Welcome, Ethan.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Are you wearing pants?
You don't have to answer that.
It's going to be a different thing for me.
Have you learned nothing from Greg and me?
I've learned much.
I don't know how to take that.
So it's not your first day of school, but it's pretty close. Tell us about Ethan's new adventure.
Yeah, so in some sense, this is the 31st first day of school. But what's really exciting for me this year is that I'm going to be starting my first day of school at a new job in a new country. So I'm going to be moving back to the United States and starting out as an assistant professor at the University of Delaware in their Education Statistics and Research Methods program.
Congratulations. That is a big deal. We actually have you here for a purpose today.
Wait. We do?
No.
I thought that was the whole gag and we were just wrapping up.
It's shorter episodes this season, guys.
Yes, the whole season 6 is just going to be inane banter and then we're just going to wrap up.
Well, that's okay because that's all people listen to. Well, let's try this anyway. Before we get to the topic that we're hoping to talk about, people generally like to know a little bit about origin stories. And honestly, even though we've had you on a bunch of times before, I don't know how much we went through your origin story before. So can you take us a little bit through how you came to be, who you are, where you are?
So I'm part of the club of people who didn't come into grad school at all thinking, I want to do quantitative methods work. I started graduate school in a developmental neuroscience lab. I was really interested in learning and how the capacity for learning changes developmentally. And so we moved after my second year of grad school to the University of North Carolina. And I was really fortunate to have the first class I took be multi-level modeling with Dan Bauer. And then a year later, took Patrick's class in structural equation modeling. Those two classes got me interested in quant methods for itself. At first, I was really interested in, okay, how can these methods be applied to my research program and answer interesting questions? But the more I took classes and applied the models, I started wanting more of a mechanistic understanding of how they worked, why they worked the way they did. I just sort of kept taking classes, and Patrick and Dan were generous enough to semi-adopt me into the quantitative methods program at the University of North Carolina. I was just on that edge of being a quant-savvy, hopefully, neuroscientist as I graduated. Mm-hmm. I had the experience, let's call it, of graduating in 2020 right into my solo apartment. And I was doing a postdoc in neuroscience, but really kind of not finding it quite as fulfilling as I had thought it would be, and sort of at a bit of loose ends. And I basically just emailed Patrick kind of out of the blue and was like, I'm not super happy. I'm not sure I want to keep doing this. At some point, he and I had talked about some ideas for a quant paper, maybe pursuing that. And he threw the barn doors open and said, yeah, let's have at it. And that sort of snowballed. I ended up taking a second postdoc in the Netherlands. That was a really nice transition point. It was in the middle between quant methods and applied work in developmental neuroscience. And then I applied for and got a job as an assistant professor in the Netherlands at Leiden University in the methodology and statistics department. And so that was sort of my big boy step into quantitative methods. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of set the stage for what I've done in the past 3 years, really moving into studying the models themselves, being interested in making quantitative work the core of what my program of research is, part of that next step, applying to and getting this job at the University of Delaware.
A couple things about your story that I just want to key in on. One is, it's a very brave thing to do, to transition after you've earned a doctorate. The other thing is that I hope it's actually really encouraging for people out there who are feeling sort of quant adjacent, but maybe are drawn to it. Here is a person who is starting a second faculty position in quantitative methodology. So you're very inspirational.
I really do, though, have to give credit to Patrick, Dan, and Katie Gates as well, who let me join her lab during my time at UNC. It's been a lovely experience of people who officially on paper didn't owe me anything, but were nevertheless really generous in supporting me and giving me access to opportunities I wouldn't have had otherwise. I'd like to think I worked a little hard to get where I am, but I also know that I wouldn't have gotten there without those people.
That's very sweet of you to say, and it was a treat for us because we couldn't get rid of you, right? Sometimes you can't get a student to come, the office hours are empty. You were proactive about things, and you reached out to people and you knocked on doors. There's an old saying that comes up often in these kinds of settings is that you work really hard to be lucky.
I like that. The actual reason that we brought you here today is a project that the three of us collaborated on that I think is so exciting, so important, and such a beautiful microcosm of so much that we do in academia that I'm excited to talk about it. Can you start easing us into that?
Sure. This is a paper that came out this year in Psychological Methods called Latent Growth Factors as Predictors of Distal Outcomes. And this is a paper whose ideas really stretch back, again, all the way back to graduate school, of Patrick mentioning something in class and me chasing him across the courtyard as he attempted to flee back to his office.
That was not figurative. That was literal.
Oh, God, he's following me. He's following me. Is he still there?
I would have an Irish goodbye from classes. I would just be mid-slide and just walk out to try to give myself a head start.
What he didn't know was I'm a runner. But the paper focuses on this really nice framing that Patrick has used a number of times, both in writing and in teaching. Longitudinal analysis, developmental theory are all concerned about modeling the course, the cause, and the consequences of development. The course is sort of that unconditional growth model. What is the developmental trajectory of X? Is it increasing, decreasing? Does it increase and then plateau? The causes are bringing in predictors. For whom do they show different patterns of growth? And then what we were really interested in developing methods around for this paper was those consequences. What are the downstream results of individual differences in growth over time? Does differences in trajectories about risk-taking or mental health predict what happens later on, those life outcomes? Things like contact with the criminal justice system, long-term health outcomes, cognitive outcomes maybe in aging, the things that we like to measure as sort of ultimate outcomes in these models. And that's really what we focused on in terms of developing methods around how do we go about using individual differences in patterns of growth to predict those downstream consequences.
If I were trying to make up a question in this area, I might say something like, I wonder if kids who are quick learners have some kind of better success, a higher graduation rate, or some better life outcome. And being a quick learner then would have something to do with their trajectory in terms of how quickly or how slowly they might have learned something over time, right? So it's like slope as predictor in this case.
Exactly. And you could imagine all sorts of combinations of questions like that, right? What about kids who come into, let's say, secondary school at higher levels of math and show greater gains in math over time, right? Does some combination of that information predict graduation rates in post-secondary school or college attendance or lifetime earnings, right? You can think of a lot of these different potential outcomes that are important for people's lives.
I like that you brought in the other characteristics of growth as well, because I have a habit of thinking about it literally in terms of the growth trajectory. But what you're saying is that that sits in a context with other aspects of growth. For example, where people might have started along their trajectory.
A lot of times our theories talk about the rate, but it does really matter where individuals come into the process starting out. And we often represent that with the intercept. And so that ends up being important, both theoretically, but also mathematically.
And I would love to take credit for the triad of the course, causes, and consequences of development, but I blatantly plagiarized that from John Willett. He was the one who I first saw writing about it, but some of this goes all the way back to Piaget. One of the fundamental notions of developmental science, not only does the earlier level on something predict some later behavior, but that earlier change predicts later change. That, I think, is often talked about, but is not often tested. There is this wonderful framework of the latent change score model that came out of the incredibly creative head of Jack McCardle. That does look at change predicting change, but only in time-adjacent measures. So does the change that happened between 1 and 2 predict the change on another construct between 2 and 3? And what we're talking about here is at the level of the trajectory. So as Ethan is saying, does a child who accelerates more rapidly than their peers, is that potentially predictive of some distal downstream outcome? But might that be a kind of time machine? If you're trying to identify high-risk kids for experiencing aggressive behavior or substance use or falling behind in reading, and you observe them over a period of time, could you somehow look at the overall level and rate of change to say, ooh, we know that this kid is at risk of some later behavior that hasn't happened before? But then where all three of us had so much fun in doing this is I wrote a paper with Bengt Mutain in 1997 where we drew those path diagrams and said anyone can do that. That was 27 years ago. Well, it turns out it's a little bit harder than just drawing the picture.
We even have a footnote comparing where we were relatively in our developmental trajectories when that paper was published.
I love trying to get things into footnotes over my whole career. It's just been a game I have of can you put silly things in footnotes? We got away with one. I will read it verbatim. It is footnote 2. As an anecdotal example of the long-standing elusiveness of this topic, Patrick Curran received a grant to study these models in 1999 that ultimately did not achieve its stated goal due to limitations in computational methods at the time. Ethan M. McCormick's anecdotal examples from this time are slightly less relevant as he was in the second grade.
And I was having a great second grade experience.
You were living your best life in Arkansas in second grade?
I was crushing those fractions. I was doing really great.
Now, here's part of the fun story that Greg alluded to in saying that this is a microcosm of why we love working in quantitative methods. I told Ethan how the paper was going to come out and that he should go and do it. Without exaggeration, every single thing I told you was going to happen not only did not happen, but it came out in the opposite. Ethan would bring me simulated results that were opposite of what I said was going to happen. And being the supportive advisor that I was, I accused him of making an error in his code and that he needed to be more careful.
As usual, in a purely audio medium, I'm going to ask people to imagine a path diagram. We'll start simple in a linear growth function. So you have an intercept latent factor and a slope latent factor. And you have all these indicators that are the repeated measures. And what we're interested in doing in this paper is drawing one box out to the side, and it has to be to the side because Greg is wrong about where latent variables live. But it's to the side, to the right specifically. And we're going to call that Z. And Z is going to be that distal outcome that we're interested in, that consequence. And we were really, at first, thinking about this paper as how do we optimally describe the prediction from the growth trajectory to the distal outcome? And one of the central things we were wrestling with is that neither the intercept nor the slope really describes the trajectory as a whole, but rather they jointly describe it. We did the straightforward thing, and we predicted that distal outcome with both the intercept and the slope. And we found a positive association between individual differences in the slope and the distal outcome. So theoretically, those who show faster increases over time in the developmental outcome show greater levels of the distal outcome.
Seems straightforward.
Very straightforward. And we did the classic thing where we set the intercept to be at the first time point. So we had 0, 1, 2, all the way up to t on the slope factor loadings. Mm-hmm. And that was great. Done and dusted. No one gets hurt.
What'd you just say?
I know.
What the hell was that?
Hello everyone. Today's business idiom is done and dusted, which means to be complete and finished.
Oh my God.
I've somehow combined two aphorisms from Patrick.
Besides, nobody's getting hurt. That guy was already up there when I got here.
You are an independent scholar now, and I need to back off. But dude, it is in and out, and nobody gets hurt.
Done and dusted.
Part of the process of becoming independent from your advisor is realizing they're not always right about their phrases that they say.
But dusted?
Yeah.
Are you making pastries? Come on.
I'm trying to talk about science right now.
Oh,
so if we could
sorry,
focus
go ahead.
in. At one point, I decided to try something based on a paper that Jeremy Biezance had published in 2004 that looked at time coding effects. So what happens if we take that default factor loading pattern for the slope, right, 0, 1, 2, 3, and we just subtracted t from it. So now it's -4, -3, -2, -1, 0. In principle, those models should and are likelihood equivalent. What was really puzzling us was the fact that suddenly that relationship between the slope and the distal outcome was negative. And this is the thing that Patrick and I went back and forth about to the point where I was like, fine, you tell me where I'm going wrong. And yeah, it's not proc IML syntax, it's R syntax, so good luck.
Which he printed out, stapled it, and threw it at me.
To be fair, if you set the intercept to be estimated at the first time point, you get a positive association. So faster change over time leads to more of the distal outcome. But when you code time such that the intercept is estimated at the final time point, you get a negative relationship. So now faster change is related to less of the distal outcome. Exactly opposite. We went from a significant positive effect to a significant negative effect of the slope, and we had no idea where that was coming from. As I'm describing how we're changing the model, right, we're changing the placement of the intercept. And in prior work, what had been shown was that changing the location of the intercept had changed the parameters associated with the intercept. And here, with this distal outcome model, we were now getting changes in the parameter associated with the slope. And that became the entire exploration of the paper is, why is this happening? And then once we understood why it was happening, what could we do to address it?
And this to me is just really bothersome from a theoretical standpoint. If I'm asking a question like, if you're a faster learner, what bearing does that have on your likelihood of graduation? I don't care about your intercept. To me, what you're saying is when I do this thing to something else in the model that you don't necessarily care about, it affects your ability to answer this question. And this is extraordinarily bothersome.
And this very thing is the source of my incorrect predictions, because I was incredibly fortunate to be a co-author on that Biazon's paper. And under Jeremy's leadership, it really is a wonderful paper. And if you've not seen this and you do growth modeling, it should be required reading. Jeremy did remarkable work on that. The walkaway point is you can put the intercept at the beginning, the middle, the end. It changes the mean, the variance, the covariance. They're all likelihood equivalent. The core finding is your predictors of the intercept change with different codings of time, but across all codings, the predictors of the slope are the same. And as Greg says, that is how it should be. The slope, when we change the intercept value of what does 0 represent, we're holding those slopes constant and we're just moving the axes left and right. Yeah. Where does that y-axis intersect the trajectories, but the slopes are constant? But what Ethan found, and I did not believe for an extended period of time, until he so unprofessionally threw the code at me, is that when you go to the distal outcome, exactly the opposite changes. Because not only does beta change, but alpha doesn't.
Think about the importance of this. Someone asks the question about the relation that the slope has to some particular distal outcome. They could be getting an entirely different result depending on how they parameterized a part of the model that you don't really care about that much. And so it makes me wonder, about these conclusions that people have reached out there, how much we can really trust them. So this is not an inconsequential problem.
And as we showed in both simulated and real data, you can get a significant positive effect, you can get a non-significant effect, and you can get a significant negative effect, all within the same longitudinal data set, just depending on that time coding decision you make.
For models that are likelihood equivalent,
Yep.
They're all fit the data exactly the same way. And this is what made my eyes cross. The intercept represents a fundamentally different aspect of the growth process. What does the model implied mean at the beginning of the process, at the middle of the process, at the end of the process? That mean and variance represent a fundamentally different aspect of development, yet that stays constant.
So it actually really relates back to something that Greg was just saying. If you're a fast versus a slow learner, you don't necessarily care about the intercept, but actually the intercept is this really important context. Are you a fast learner that comes off a high baseline, a low baseline? And what ends up being important is actually the correlation. You have correlated predictors in what ultimately is a regression of the latent factors predicting the distal outcome, and the correlation between them changes as a function of that different time coding decision you make, and therefore what the unique effects of predicting the distal outcome are. And so it's that unique effect problem that we know about from regression that ends up being really key on guiding whether we get that positive, non-significant, or negative effect potentially.
And what Ethan showed that was so fascinating is the mean changes of alpha, the variance changes of alpha, the covariance between alpha and beta changes, but they scale in a way that it makes the effect of alpha to the distal outcome constant. So they cancel each other out. And then the beta, which is like, hey guys, leave me out of this. I'm not changing my mean. I'm not changing my variance. Its mean and variance are constant, but that covariance is changing. And Ethan showed both with simulated data, real data, and in the derivations, that is the source of the issue, is that those changes in the covariance are canceling out in the alpha effect, but not in the beta effect.
It's like this really complicated gymnastic trick that all the parameters associated with the intercept do that end up right back at the exact same place. They've done a triple axel, but they've landed at exactly the same place.
You've been watching the Olympics, haven't you?
I have, and it's been wonderful.
She can't second guess. She has to go right up and do it. Yes! That triple axel will go down in the record books.
I have to say, Patrick, that you really set me up because I gave a presentation on the course, the cause, and the consequences here. It was not a long presentation, but it was in front of an audience that had a strong European contingent. I went with the whole narrative about how incredulous this is, that based on the research where we have predictors of the growth characteristics, this is what happens. And so that leads us to think, and then I switched over to the consequences and I said, and yet what actually happened is the following. And someone in the audience raised their hand and said, but why would we expect this to be the same? Because the covariance between the two things is different. And we know that when we have two different predictors with different covariances, that we should get the different. And they completely burst the bubble in what I wanted to do. So you set me up for that.
And so somebody figured out in 30 seconds something that I've struggled for a decade with? Thanks for pointing that out in a public venue, Hancock.
To be fair, it was someone with an umlaut in their name.
Oh, okay.
I know.
I was joking. Sorry, it must have gotten lost in translation. No, we understand you perfectly. Everyone in Sweden speaks English.
We also speak Norwegian, Dutch, German, French, Russian, and Finnish.
Well, I have almost memorized Gangnam Style phonetically, so samesies.
I don't know this word samesies.
From context, I believe it means proudly uneducated.
Fair enough.
But what's really troublesome about the way it changes, and this was part of what we wanted to get to, was not just, oh yeah, we know that it changes, but actually can we write a function for it? The magnitude of the prediction from the slope to the distal outcome changes linearly as a function of the magnitude of the relationship between the intercept and the distal outcome. So actually, the more important, from a predictive sense, the intercept is, the worse your slope effect is going to change across these different time codings. And so it's linear, it's unbounded. So those effects are just going to sort of wander off into infinity. And potentially the more data you have, the thing we most often say is a good thing, might actually work against you because you have more units of time over which for your slope effect to potentially change.
We have now spent a tremendous amount of time talking about how maybe we weren't the sharpest knives in the drawer. What do we do about it? What's the right way out of this?
So because that covariance is really what's driving these changes in the effect of the slope, we developed two approaches in the paper to deal with that fact, essentially by trying to remove the influence of that changing covariance. So one approach is to find a point in the trajectory where we can estimate the intercept, where we'll get a zero covariance. So we're getting completely uncorrelated predictors for that distal outcome part of the model. And then another way, which is a more model-based way, attempts to isolate the variance of the slope from the variance in the intercept such that we induce that zero correlation. But both of them are really focused on trying to make maximally uncorrelated predictors that then we can use in that regression of the distal outcome on the latent variables.
But it doesn't get around the problem that if you move the 0 point a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right, that relation is going to change. This is where the three of us so struggled. Mm-hmm. It is a defensible way to say at what point in the timeline is the covariance between alpha and beta minimized, and we're going to evaluate the relation between slope and the distal outcome at that point. That's a totally justified, unambiguous time point, but you made a plot in that paper that should terrify anyone who has used these models. And folks, if you do this kind of stuff in work or if you teach it or whatnot, I really do recommend you look at Ethan's work here, because he used this method from regions of significance when we probe an interaction. And there's a plot in that paper that is utterly terrifying because it shows across the time coding where there's an area of the plot where it's significant and positive, it goes to non-significant, and then is significant and negative. And that still exists, but we're just picking a point where we say, I got to pick one, I'm just going to do this. You propose these two methods for dealing with it. Does it solve the problem, or does it just kind of pound some nails in the floor where we can pick a point in time that we interpret?
I think theoretically it's more the latter. It's more nailing down based on certain criteria, right? This criteria of minimized covariance. This is a good place, we think, for making maximally interpretable regression coefficients. We're making those unique effects as interpretable as possible. But again, because they're likelihood equivalent, you could just as well say, I don't want to estimate my intercept at that time point. I care about estimating the intercept at another time point. And I think that's perfectly reasonable. Is if that really is your strong theory, then I think you probably should estimate your model where you care about something. What we're hoping to do with these approaches is really say, in the absence of a strong theoretical preference for a particular time point where I want to know final status in this model for whatever reason, and so I'm going to put my intercept at the final time point, I think that's okay. But in the absence of that, what we would prefer is those maximally interpretable regression coefficients. And so then these approaches help you do that. But I think there is an enormous amount of work left to be done about what do we do with likelihood equivalent models that give us theoretically opposite results? How do we reconcile that, except to understand that what's driving some of those might be not quite statistical artifacts. I don't want to say that there's something coming in that's not part of the model system already, because we really are sort of reshuffling information when we change the time coding. We're not generating new information or losing it. But it is driven by these changes in the covariance in a way that I think people might not want to deal with if they don't have to.
So maybe as a reflection of how Greg and I each approach the field, the two examples you gave both had Greg's fingerprints on them in a paper on minimizing the covariance between alpha and beta and a paper on incremental variance. Greg seems to be more invested in offering solutions to problems, where I seem to find more entertainment in identifying the problems and then walking away. This was a lot like my undergrad, where at the time in Colorado, drinking age was 18. And so even in high school, you could go to bars. I would start a fight, but then walk away as soon as things started heating up. That's kind of what I've done intellectually as well. But give us a 30-second summary each of what is this aperture and what is the incremental variance, just as the two strategies that you're proposing.
The first, that sort of minimizing the covariance approach, is an approach that Greg called the aperture. So it's the point in the trajectory where the covariance is minimized naturally, and it should go to zero. And there's a nice formula that helps you identify it, which is just the covariance of the two factors divided by the variance of the slope. You estimate your first model, and the model estimates sort of give you this very simple formula about how much you need to shift your time coding in order to estimate the model at the aperture. You can sort of do this in this 1-2 step. There are also some automated approaches that we detail in the supplement, but the idea is that you can identify how far away from that aperture you are just using this sort of simple formula. The other approach is more of a model-based approach. It's a little bit more complicated, but it's based on some work by Yifeng and Greg in a paper that came out in 2022. And the idea here is that if you regress the factor you care less about, for our read on the literature, that is often the intercept term. If you regress it on the slope, all of that shared covariance is removed from the intercept and now resides solely with the slope for when you go ahead and predict that distal outcome. And you need to trick the model a little bit. You estimate these unique factors. And again, the details are all laid out in the paper. But the idea is that you sort of allow all of that shared variance to live with the factor you care the most about theoretically. For most people, that's going to be the slope. And then you use both of these unique factors to predict the distal outcome. And what's cool about that is it means that it no longer matters what time coding scheme you use. On the Y side, on the repeated measure side, you're always going to get invariant effects for both the intercept and the slope. And so it's a nice way to sidestep the whole issue.
The thing that I like about that approach is that it's consistent with the way I think about what I'm doing from a substantive standpoint, right? If I go back and I say, I want to know whether or not how quickly kids learn, predict something else, and I don't care about the intercept. You put it wherever wherever you want. You put it at the start of at the Big Bang. I don't care. But it at least gives the slope priority in the prediction, which is the way I tend to think about it from a substantive standpoint.
And there are a couple avenues that I think that kind of model opens up. Again, like Greg's saying, you can estimate the intercept wherever you want, which is really cool if you have predictors that you want to bring in to a particular time in the trajectory. Maybe you don't care in the aperture way about predicting that time point, but you do care about predicting the beginning or the end of the trajectory. And so this model-based approach allows you to say, I'm going to set the intercept wherever I want it to be for these theoretical reasons, but I'm still going to get that invariant effect of the slope. So it potentially opens up some additional avenues for research in these models where you can kind of get this nice, dare I say, mediation-like effect where you have some prior cause predicting trajectories, which in turn then go and predict distal outcomes. And so that's some really exciting future possibilities that come out of some of these modeling approaches.
There's also been some very recent work on using growth factors as mediators, as you're talking about. And here's the drunken punch in the face, which is happening to my friend because I started the fight, but then I am hiding in the bathroom stall. Biazons showed that if you have a set of predictors of alpha and beta, that when you change time, the prediction of alpha changes, but beta doesn't. And then you showed, hey, funny story, guys, that when you use alpha and beta to predict a distal outcome, alpha doesn't change and beta does. But when you bolt them together, and your growth factors are mediators, and you talk about where to put time, the prediction of alpha varies by time, but not alpha predicting the distal outcome. Your prediction of beta does not vary over time, but beta does predicting Z. I mean, holy crap, how do you make any sense of that?
I can make it one better is...
But wait!
And they're often referred to as things like parallel process growth models, where you want to use one trajectory to predict another trajectory. Suddenly you have two time coding considerations you need to make, one for the first growth process, one for the other growth process. We've joked about this a whole bunch over the years, is we came into this thinking we're going to write one paper that's going to really solve the best approaches for predicting distal outcomes from latent growth processes. And honestly, we never got out of the cul-de-sac of what the heck do you do with time coding?
The reason we got into it is we were deeply bothered by the notion of controlling for one factor over the other. We didn't know how this reversal was going to come out, and that was a surprise. And I led you to that in a supportive and guiding way that I've done over the years that we've worked together.
Sort of like how I learned to swim by being tossed into the deep end and said,
you know, you got to learn how to swim somehow.
He's at the bottom. Is someone going to get him?
Yeah, he needs to find his way back. In fairness to us, see, now that we're collegial, it used to be in fairness to me, but now in fairness to us, it goes back to something you alluded to early in this conversation, is we have a trajectory, and it's defined by an alpha and a beta. Let's just keep things simple with a linear. There's an intercept and a slope. Those only make substantive sense when you treat them jointly. Is the alpha, does that mean anything in the absence of the beta? Does the beta mean anything in the absence of the alpha? And what you and I were really troubled about was, what does it even mean to look at the unique effect of beta predicting an outcome controlling for alpha? Where we thought it was going to go is the second paper you wrote.
And what we initially thought was going to solve this, put it away, and say, we're done, we never have to worry about this again, is a good old latent interaction. What's the joint effect of the intercept and the slope predicting some distal outcome? And all we have to do is create a product of two variables that don't exist. What could go wrong?
That are completely dependent on where you put zero.
Sure. Without going too far into the weeds, not only does the interaction not help solve this time coding problem, it turns out that the interaction, in fact, complicates the time coding effects even more, to the point where you basically are violating the triangular structure of certain matrices, where effects just add together I couldn't quite figure out where in the math 2 times an effect came out. And it turns out that it's estimating at the lower triangle and the upper triangle. But because the model doesn't know how to handle that, it just adds them together. And so it turns out that you really kind of can't get away from this time coding problem, and that the interactions, while I think are interesting theoretically for all of the reasons that we just talked about, mathematically they really are just kind of a kick in the pants.
You and I thought the first paper would be a couple of pages. The solution would be the interaction. And the interaction just made a bad situation infinitely worse.
Turns out that statistics does not in fact care about your feelings or your preconceived notions. When starting out really feeling unsure about, am I actually good enough at this quant thing? Can I come up with original ideas and work through the math? And this paper was such an excellent learning opportunity. Despite what it may sound like, the two of you were incredibly patient and helpful. Feeling the training wheels coming off on tackling that interaction paper felt really great. Ironically, having a sort of meeting with you the last time I was in North Carolina, and maybe slightly going into advisor mode, and kind of just realizing oh, maybe I am a big kid now, and maybe they'll let me sit at the full table at Thanksgiving this year.
Well, I wouldn't go that far.
Yeah.
There's a wonderful coffee shop nearby, and I wanted to get out of the house, and I went out and I met with my lovely graduate student, Jen, who contributed to the final episode at the end of season 5. And just because I'm lazy and wanted to be efficient, is I did back-to-back meetings where I was going to wrap up with Jen and then meet with Ethan. And Ethan came and the three of us sat. Jen pitched her idea to Ethan, and you went into advisor role and were wonderful. I couldn't agree more that you are so ready to move into that. Now, that said, you are shiny out of the box at the University of Delaware. Are you looking for future gens?
Yeah, absolutely. Starting this fall, I'll be reviewing applications for our PhD program in education, statistics, and research methods. So yeah, I really am excited. If people are interested or know of interested students, they can get in contact with me.
Well, definitely anybody who gets to work with you is very, very lucky because you are so ready. So we're going to do this one time. We're going to get you ready for your first day of school. We will take the picture on the porch. Or wait, we'll take the picture by the tree.
No, you won't.
Okay. We will pack your lunch. Do you want the crusts cut off of your PB&J or do you want the crusts left on?
How much do you know him? Of course you cut the crusts off.
And diagonal.
Right. And a cut. Yeah, that's right. You have to have the triangles. Yes, of course, I know the answer to all of those things. So we'll pack your lunch. We'll take you to the school bus. We're very excited for the start of school for you.
We're not making him ride the bus. We're driving him right up to the front.
I'm not driving him. You drive him.
Thank you, Ethan. This is so much fun. And the entire arc from when you first walked into my office, and I wonder if I needed to call campus police or not, the entire thing that has brought us here has been nothing but joyful. And thank you for sharing your time with us.
And thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ethan. It's a pleasure.
And thanks to listeners. Thank you for episode number 1. I cannot believe your lack of judgment in continuing to listen to us, but we really do appreciate it.
Thanks so much, everybody. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much for joining us.
Wait.
Tate, what are you doing?
I have the new theme music.
Oh, buddy. I said I needed that by the start of season 6.
Well, isn't today the start of season 6?
Well, yeah, but...
So technically it's not late then, right?
I mean...
So then I should get full credit for getting in on time.
Are you sure you're not already a college student?
347 more days.
All right, son. Full credit.
I hope you like the new theme music.
All right. Let's give it a shot here. Ooh, spicy.
I know, right?
Like skibbity riz spice?
No, Dad. Just no.
Okay. Thanks so much for joining us for season 6. Don't forget to tell your friends to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever they go to learn that their rate of personal growth may or may not have any predictable consequences. They'll never know for sure. You can also follow us on X or Blue Sky and visit our website, quantitudepod.org, where you can leave us a message, find organized playlists and show notes and syllabi, search for past episodes, and other fun stuff. And finally, check out our cool Quantitude merch, like shirts, mugs, stickers, and spiral notebooks from redbubble.com, where all proceeds from non-bootleg authorized merch go to donorschoose.org to help support low-income schools. You've been listening to Quantitude, the podcast where the teachers inspire you. Which is to say, they make you think, heck, if these asshats can do it. In the spirit of today's back-to-school theme, today's episode has been sponsored by Regression, what most of your academic skills did over the summer. And by Principal Components, when your dimension reduction needs a bit more authority than vice principal components. And by Bonferroni, the classic pasta dish that the lunch lady is cooking up right now. It's almost done. And by Latent Classes. Those are the ones you missed in the morning because you slept through your alarm. And finally, by Students T-Test, the test with the increased likelihood of having a grandmother die right around exam time. This is most definitely not NPR.